Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Phil Stuff podcast. We haven't been here for a while, but I'm returning back with some wonderful guests, and one of them is Professor Dr. David Hershenov. Dr. Hershenov is specializing in metaphysics and bioethics. He has written a lot of stuff regarding personal identity and abortion. We already had one episode specifically regarding personal identity, but I wanted to bring this topic up again because I'm really, really interested in it. And I want to personally thank Dr. Hershenov for coming here and wanting to do this discussion. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And could you please be willing to introduce yourself to our audience?
I am a professor at the University of Buffalo, and I'm the director of the Romanell Center for Clinical Ethics and Philosophy of Medicine. I was the co-director, and my co-director resigned, and so I just thought on conceptual grounds, you can't have a single co-director, so I made myself the director, and the dean does not seem to have noticed or cared, so I promoted myself. Fortunately, I can't give myself a raise, but I did promote myself. And I started out at an unphilosophical growing up. I think the only philosophical thought I ever had was I wanted to be a pro baseball player. And I was wondering, could I use products or advertise products that I didn't personally use? That was the closest I came to a philosophical discussion. And then my senior year in high school, I was trying to impress a girl who was very into psychology. So I started reading on that. And then I came across this existential psychology. They would have little quotes from Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Sartre and Heidegger. And that got me very interested in existentialism, which made me a very depressed freshman. You know, my friends would go, let's go out and eat. I'm like, why? We're just going to die. And then I remember coming back and lecturing my poor dad as an electrical engineer on the evils of technology because I had read Heidegger. So I started as a continental philosopher, then went to the New School for Social Research. I was a continental philosopher at University of California, Berkeley. Then graduate school at the New School, and then you were allowed to take courses at the other schools in New York. So when I was getting more interested in analytic philosophy, I went over to NYU, and there Parfit was visiting. And so then I got into personal identity with him and Peter Unger. And Tom Nagel was there. So that's how I ended up getting interested in personal identity. Started out as a continental philosopher, then this extreme left-wing Frankfurt School type philosopher, went to the New School, lost interest in that, got interested in analytic philosophy and issues at the intersection of personal identity and bioethics. So that's a quick,
that's
unflattering biography.
That's quite a story. That I didn't know about the continental part. I'm really surprised by that. And
still paying off the loans, I would say.
Oh, really?
Yes. And I could have had a great analytic education at Berkeley. They had Donald Davis and John Searle.
Oh, okay.
I think Bernard Williams visited, Barry Stroud, Fire Robin, but all I did is take the continental courses, much to my...
I'm not much of a fan with continental stuff, so I'm glad you switched to and contributed to the analytic field. I think that was a really good decision from your end. So to get us started, would you like to first just give us like a brief explanation of what we mean by personal identity, and then after that we can get into the briefs regarding all the views that's
right. I think the field's misnamed personal identity. I don't think there's anything interesting about identity. It is a primitive concept. Can't say anything, define it. And the property is simple, nothing to be said. I think when we talk about questions of personal identity, and when people talk about diachronic identity, is what makes a creature now at time one identifying two, we're really talking about things, persistence conditions in their nature. There aren't any interesting identity questions. It's a simple property, nothing to be said. Everything's identical itself, distinct from others. There's no way to define it. Usually have to bring in something like sameness, which will just be circular. So there's nothing to be said about identity. I think what we're really interested in are beings' natures and under what conditions they can survive. So anytime you have a question about whether he's identical to some later being, you can just paraphrase that without identity. Say, could you survive your brain being destroyed? Where are you found if your brain is moved? Could you be teletransported? When did you come into existence? When you go out? You don't even need to raise the question of identity. And then the second way it's misnamed is person identity makes you think the debate is just going to be about persons, which historically it has, thanks to Locke. And as people have said, all the person identity literature is really footnotes to Locke. That's truer than saying philosophy's footnotes to Plato. But, it could be that we're not essentially persons. That a person is a phase of an animal. And so what we're really interested in is what are we? And when we came into existence and when do we go out of existence? And the answer to that may not have much to do with persons. Could be that persons are just identical to the human persons identical to human animal. I mean, there's angelic persons, divine persons, robotic persons. But, we're interested in what we are when we come in, when we go out of existence, what we are essentially. And the answer may be we're an animal essentially, and we're a person contingently. But again, the word person is so ambiguous. Some people mean it to pick out our moral traits. Some people will use person to pick out something that has a radical capacity for thought that it could have even when it was mindless. And then there's the Lockean tradition, the more dominant one, where being a person is having these capacities to reason, reflect, think of oneself at different times. And that could be actually a contingent property, not an essential one. So, two senses, the question's misnamed, is not necessarily about persons, although we're persons, we want to know what we are, but we may not be essentially persons. If we mean by that having some psychological traits ready to hand, not just some radical capacity, as in this rational substance view tradition or a hylomorphic tradition might use person that way. So that's how I see the field. It's really a question about our nature and our persistence conditions, not about identity. And personhood is, going to be why we're as valuable as we are, but it may be we're contingently persons, contingently rational. We're not essentially rational animals. We're not essentially self-conscious beings. So that's sort of how I see it.
Yeah. When you said that we could, we're maybe only, that we're not a person like an entire point of our existence, kind of reminded me of the four-dimensionalist perspective, where there are like different space-time worms who are persisting in different times. So at one time, our existence, we were not persons, and then at another time, there was another space-time worm where that space-time worm is our personhood, or sort of the constitutionalist approach where persons by virtue of something else at some point in time, but not in the other. I guess we should probably then move to what are the different views that one could take in regards to this topic.
One thing I would say, I might characterize the four-dimensional project a little differently. I think Hudson's very good on this, that with four-dimensional, there's going to be many worms that are overlapping each other and have thinking parts. And so some will be merely sentient, some will be self-conscious. There will be an animal there that'll have no parts that aren't thinking, and then merely sentient, and then rational ones, and then maybe merely sentient, and then no thinking. And so there's countless things with thinking parts. And so there's an interesting question, which should we call the person? And so what Hudson wants to do is he wants us to be essentially persons. So the person will only be those temporal parts that have self-consciousness and are then causally connected in some with the right sort of continuity. So there will never be a time that we weren't persons. I think even as a four-dimensionalist, I think our intuitions in certain cases suggest that we really identify with our animal and not not a purely psychological being. But I'll come back to that when we talk more about things like the dicephalus and so forth. But so it's very interesting what sort of selection principle we would have on four-dimensional, where there's countless things with thinking parts, especially with unrestricted composition. There's even something that consists of me and a 23rd century human being. And that's not a person. The causal connections between these two persons is not the right. And constitution is I think in one sense, the metaphysics that's most pervasive. That is, there's a constitution theory of everything. People, your clothes, there's the wool and the sweater, and money and paper and statues and clay, persons, animals. It's the only theory of personal identity that is a true answer across the board to metaphysical questions. I don't think animalism, which just says persons or animals can't tell us anything about the relation of lumps and statues. And something like the embodied mind, McMahon and later Parfit, persons are going to be parts of animals, can't tell us anything about statues and lumps. Statue is not going to be a part of the lump. So what I find fascinating about Constitution is it's really the only pervasive metaphysics, a theory of persons that can also be a theory of everything. Soul theory can't, animalism can't, embodied mind can't, various other views. So it's the most interesting in that way. I really appreciate Lynn Baker's account and Sidney Shoemaker, and there's a lot of, I think that might have been the dominant view of the psychological accounts, sort of a constitution theory, but I think Baker was the best. And it really is a theory of everything, unlike animalism, unlike embodied mind, clearly unlike a soul theory. It's not going to give you anything in the material world. So anyway, that's a quick sketch of what's interesting about four-dimensionalism, account of persons. I mean, it's not an account of personal identity, it's just a general account of things in time, persistence. And why I find Constitution so attractive. It can do far more than any other theory, even though in the end I'm going to reject it in part because of these puzzles, spatially coincident entities.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Baker. As far as I remember, Baker was sort of proponent of sort of a different type of personhood, where she, as far as I remember, she doesn't affirm. She refers that we are this first person perspective, that we're like, right, or what people will now call quality or phenomenal consciousness that sort of exists at some point in our development of an animal.
Her view is not that we're psychological states. She thinks we're 6 feet, 180 pounds. But you're right. It is that we have a robust first person perspective. So every conscious animal has a first person perspective. It sees the world from where it is. But a robust one is where you're self-conscious. You have an inner life. You can keep a diary. You can reflect and berate yourself and act morally. And she thinks that's distinctive of us. But she wants to say we actually come into existence earlier when we have a minimal first-person perspective, because she doesn't want to say we don't come into existence until long after birth. So she thinks when you have a minimal first-person perspective and you're part of a kind of thing that has a robust, then you're a person. So even though our mind as a late fetus or infant is no more sophisticated than a dog or cat, we'll be persons and they're not, because we belong to a kind that has a robust perspective. I think it's a bit of a cheat, but you depend. Your kind of being you are is going to depend on these other beings, not on the traits you have at that moment. But it's interesting.
At some point in time, I was thinking of if, and I'm really curious about your opinion on this, if it would be possible that we move the discussion on personal identity to philosophy, like not here specifically, but in general in the academics, if it would be a good idea to move the discussion from personal identity to more philosophy of mind, as that seems to sort of be more fundamental, in my opinion, compared to the different approaches that we here take.
I fear you may be right. I say I fear because I don't know much about mind. And I think if I did know a lot more about mind, I may have a very different view. Persons. I mean, I've spent most of my time trying to argue we're animals and not essentially psychological beings. But for instance, say if only thought is possible because of a soul, then I'm going to change my story. Or the only way to avoid the too many thinkers problem is with a soul. So if I knew more about mind, I might then be some sort of emergentist theorist. I might be a panpsychic, and who knows? And I think it could change my view, but I'm hoping that however the mind is generated and works, it's compatible with my animalism. I bet all the material accounts of thought would be compatible with animalism. So there wouldn't be a materialist account of mind that would say you need to be a constitution theorist rather than a animalist. I mean, there's an attempt in McMahon's and Parfit to say we're thinkers, but not all of our parts contribute to thought. So we're just consist of those parts of the brain directly involved in production of thought. And so there's an account of thought that's going to be incompatible with animalism, but I would just then deny that the brain is the thinker, and I'll do more of that today. But I would just think that your cerebrum doesn't think, and you're only thinking because you're a living being. So that would be within materialism a good account of mind, or at least how thoughts are produced, might point you towards one theory of personal identity, other. But I suspect when there is a really satisfactory, agreed upon theory of mind, if there ever is, it may not favor one theory of personal identity over another, unless it was, of course, an immaterial theory or something very close, strong emergentist type of theory. Then that would be a reason to give up animalism or constitution or the embodied mind. But within materialism, I'm not too worried. So this is some hand waving because I don't know much about philosophy of mind, but I suspect it may not. It may just be answers that can be shared by all the theories and not favor one theory, materialist account of person over the other. That's my hunch, and that's how I sort of rationalize not staying up on the literature on consciousness. Just don't have enough time.
I suppose that's a good strategy, considering that I think most views regarding philosophy of mind would still be applicable to either animalism. So it doesn't seem that one really has to give up if one is only dealing with personal identity, one has to like give up animalism in search of these other theories, where we can just, I think even a physicalist account or materialist will still be enough for an animalist, and he would face no really big charges from sort of more fundamental approaches. So you did mention constitutionalism, and you said that you don't agree with it. So I guess my first question would be, what is your view, and why do you hold to that view? What are the virtues of
it? So I'm a animalist. I had started out, as I told you, first got into the field studying with Parfit, and I found his view depressing. Not only, there's not an afterlife, but even across your time, you have less reason to care about your future. His famous view, identity doesn't matter, and the more you change, it's more like somebody else. And I found that depressing. Then I found Peter Unger's view very attractive. He thought we were essentially minimally sentient beings, more or less. We survived the loss of these Lockean highfalutin capacities, so we're not going to go out of existence with dementia. And loss of self-consciousness. And then, Unger's student, Olson's manuscript, PhD dissertation, which became his book, The Human Animal, was sent to Unger before it was published, and we had a reading group. I didn't tell Unger at the time that I found this book convincing, and I was moving away from his view. And one of the great puzzles, the thing I so much like about Eric's book, although he didn't originate it, he developed it more than anyone else, is there's going to be a problem with too many thinkers. If right here, there's a person who's distinct, but coincides with the animal. The person can use his brain to think, so can the animal. And Olson stressed these epistemic problems. How do you know whether you're the animal or the person? And he stressed some of these problems that look like there's, the animal would be contingently a person because it too is self-conscious. I, as a bioethicist, would stress the bioethical implications. I actually think there's you may find this interesting, sometimes a moral reason to favor one metaphysic over the other. A lot of people think you do the metaphysics first and then the bioethics falls out of it. But I think if there's moral realism, if that's true, then there's certain moral truths that have to be compatible with your metaphysics. I mean, take a religious person, they won't accept the metaphysics unless it's going to be able to get them into the next life where they'll get their just rewards and desserts. So there can be these sort of constraints, but even if you're not a moral realist and you don't have these web of beliefs that have to cohere, there's certain views of ourselves as autonomous agents, I think, are incompatible with psychological theories of personal identity. So let me just take a unrealistic one to make the point. Take the bread and butter transplant. This is why people think they're persons, because they have this intuition. If you move my cerebrum into another body, my psychology is over there, I've switched bodies. But the too many thinkers problem shows there's an animal there that can think. It may be in the person's body, in the person's interest, when their body's wearing down to get a new one, to switch bodies, but it would leave the animal mindless in a vegetative state. Or in a transhumanist future, maybe in the person's interest to get an inorganic body, but animals can't get inorganic parts. It would be, if enough people did it, it would be an extinction event rather than a life-extending event, because you can't get inorganic parts. So the person and the animal can't autonomously agree to the transplant. Assuming the animal thinks and has interest in its survival and in its well-being, and the person has interest in its survival well-being, since they have different persistence conditions, they can't both autonomously control this body. There will almost be like a moral dilemma. Someone's going to be wronged. And so that was, an unrealistic case. Maybe it's not that unrealistic, coming sooner than later, but it shows that there are going to be some moral puzzles. We can't be autonomous in many situations. If there's a person and an animal here, their interests will diverge. Less far-fetched, you can imagine there's an Alzheimer's drug most likely going to kill you, but it could save the person and delay their going out of existence as they lose their sophisticated reflective abilities. Maybe in the person's interest to get that drug, but if it's more likely going to kill you, then stop the decline. It's not in the animal's interest. The animal may be better off surviving with minimal consciousness. Same thing with like organ donation. The animal and the person may believe in the dead donor rule, that is, don't take their organs before they're dead, but the person will die before the animal. The person will die when the brain ceases to produce consciousness. But if you took organs then from the animal, it would kill it. And then advanced directives, the person and the animal are going to go out of existence at different times. So the person would be writing an advance directive for the animal. The person may have little interest in the animal's well-being. The animal may think it's the person, and so it's not really going to write an advance directive that takes care of itself after the loss of thought or high sophisticated thought. So from a bioethical position, if persons aren't animals, you get some very interesting moral conflicts. And they're very different from other moral conflicts. Like maybe your autonomous interests are opposed to mine. You want higher taxes. I want lower taxes. But we're talking about two things with the same body. They can't both control their body and have autonomy over it if persons aren't animals. So because of my background in bioethics, I think a lot more of sort of the moral objections to a psychological views of personal identity, I think they make autonomy in the cases I mentioned impossible. And I think a metaphysics that makes autonomy impossible for beings just like you and I is a very dubious metaphysics. Some of the standard objections, like how do we know which one, whether we're the animal or the person, this maybe can be solved by playing around with linguistic pronouns. You can have a pronoun that refers to the person, a different one for the animal. So those puzzles may not be as disturbing in the end, I think, as the moral ones. So I actually think that gives us moral reasons to prefer one metaphysics over another. So that, anyway, that's, I think, an interesting thing about how personal identity and bioethics. It's not just that personal identity is important for bioethics when is there a subject of harm. If we didn't come into existence until there's a mind, then abortions may be unproblematic. I don't think that's really true. Abortion could still be problematic, even if you and I never could be aborted, as long as there's an animal there that will end up with a mind like ours. So even though you and I can't be aborted early on, it could be greatly harmed, but that's another story. So I think personal identity is relevant. That's right. I think bioethics is relevant to choosing your metaphysics. I think personal identity is very important for bioethics because we're interested when there's someone there who can be a subject of harm. And so all these beginning and end of life, you really need to know your metaphysics, not just your bioethics. Anyway, that's why I'm so interested in these issues.
That was very, very good, the explanation. And you did mention brain death, specifically that animal survives and person dies. I've seen there's some papers from like Marin Koenig argues this, and there's David Olderberg, and there are, I think, Jason Overall or a couple other philosophers argue that perhaps brain death isn't really just that of the person, but also an animal, and that we wrongly characterize people who are currently in a coma, like a vegetative state or permanent vegetative state, as being brain dead, when really they must still be alive, but perhaps with a low chance of regaining consciousness until like their whole organism stops functioning. Do you have any thoughts on that, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, when I was saying a psychological theorist, something like a constitution theorist, they're going to go with an upper brain criterion of death, not whole brain, because much of the brain is involved with integrating these autonomic biological processes that have nothing to do with thought. So people like Jeff McMahon will think you can never go into a persistent vegetative state where your upper cerebrum's destroyed, but your brainstem may still be functioning, and there still may be controlling respiration, modulating heart rate, sleep-wake cycles, various brainstem reflexes, and neurohormone control the body. So the psychological theorists would probably think we go out of existence even before brain death. Then the animalists, as you mentioned, they're going to be divided. There's going to be people who follow Schumann, who are going to think that the brain fine-tunes an existing organism. It's not a central integrator whose activity is constitutive of life. While people like Ebro and Marin Kondo think the brain does do that. brain death is the death of the organism. There's some reasons to be suspicious. I mean, we were once all brainless embryos, and we were dependent on our mother's bodies, but we didn't need a brain. Maybe later when we're born and we're in a very difficult, complex environment, then a brain is required for integration. So these are very tough biological questions hinging on integration. So, I mean, what is the correct account? And it gets so complicated when you're in ICU and you have all these things substituting for the brain. When do we have a ventilated corpse? When do we have a still integrated living thing? I'm not sure. I seem to be a little more sympathetic to this traditional circulatory respiratory criterion. But there's a lot of people who think we're animals, essentially, and think the brain's crucial. And there's a lot of metaphysicians who think we can even be reduced to the size of the brain. That's a very maimed organism. Van Wagen and Olson have that view. So it really hinges on the biology, although it's metaphysically informed biology. So I myself is not as well informed about the biology that I would like to be. I think I lean towards the Schumann account, although I found that my adherence was very weakened by reading Condick's papers and some of her distinctions between integration and coordination. But I'm just open to it. And I just feel I just don't know enough about biology when this thermodynamic anti-entropic point of no return has been reached. And I don't know if the brain's crucial or if we don't need the brain and the brain just fine tunes an already existing organism. I have these suspicions because I was pretty sure I was once a brainless embryo. But maybe the brain became necessary. But Schumann has all these interesting accounts where people diagnosed as brain dead did a lot of things that look like integration. Perhaps the most interesting one is gestating a fetus until it could be viable and removed by a C-section. That's pretty impressive for a dead woman. I said to Maureen Condick once, she goes, oh no, the mother does very little, the fetus does everything. I go, next time my wife's pregnant and she asks for special help, I go, oh, the brain dead could do that. Maureen said, don't, you're going to get slapped or scolded. But anyway, it's a biological question. I don't feel competent. I'm pretty sure we're animals for metaphysical reasons and not something co-located or a part of that animal. But when that animal goes out of existence, that I'm just not biologically informed enough to say, is it with whole brain or is it with circulatory respiratory cessation? And then you have to qualify it with an irreversibility condition. And that's very tricky and interesting.
So do you think that by going with either of those views would be perhaps maybe some views maybe more problematic for animalists, or do you think that an animalist can still like go through all of these without an issue, or perhaps encounter a little issue?
Yeah, I mean, there are animalists on both sides. Some animals think you can even become reduced to the brain, and some of these hylomorphic ones think you can even reduce to the size of the cerebrum, and these Thomistic hylomorphics think there's an animal in purgatory with to completely disembodied with a single part, their soul. Because these radical capacities are still there, they're an animal. And other people think the brain is not it's an organ. It's not a living organism, even when everything else has been amputated. It's not doing those. You have to just have too much external support to maintain it. So you really can't say it's a living being. These processes, it has some control, but it's not controlling much. This detached head, all these support, it's not engaging in the metabolic integrative activities. I may play a controlling role, but it itself is not going to count as a living being. So there's debates whether the organism can become brain size. And there's some people who think it's not an organism. Some people, Mark Johnson, think we're animals contingently because we can become brain size, but no animal can become brain size. So we once were bigger and then we can become smaller. So again, I think in the end, we need to be very more biologically informed than many of the people in the debate are. Olson himself has read Schumann and has moved a little closer to the circulatory respiratory criterion. But again, we're philosophers, and these are really, we can reflect on what we mean by integration and what we mean by reversibility. And but a lot of it, we need to be more biologically informed than many of us. But it seems like analysts are at home in either criterion for death, either the whole brain and the brainstem or the circulatory respiratory. And they all seem to be opposed to the upper criterion that you would go out of existence in a persistent vegetative state, even if you weren't even connected to life support and you could swallow on your own and breathe on your own. The psychological accounts seem to think then you're gone. because that capacity for thought's not there, but the capacity for life's still there, and you don't even need much support. So interesting, very difficult question. Fascinating.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. But I guess I want to move to this very specific and probably one of the most rehearsed objections to animalism I think there is. It is the objection from the monozygotic twinning, where we originally start with a single zygote who, at some point in pregnancy, up to I think 11 or 12 days, has the ability that under apparently no external factors sort of either duplicate or split into two, perhaps even identical zygotes. So kind of like the symmetric monozygotic twinning. And a lot of animalists have offered some responses to this, but I would really be interested in hearing yours specifically. I know that you have like a 2003 paper on it, and I know that you have of course published more from them.
Is the question we could we have existed early on when twinning was still possible, or is the question do we survive twinning? Could we survive twinning?
I guess the question is mostly both, as in what happens, what is that's happening there? Did we exist before, and maybe it was a different kind of a zygote that has the power to do that, or perhaps we didn't exist then and now exist after twinning. So
okay. So I think the claim that we didn't exist as a zygote because of the possible twinning is a little more problematic than many of my, especially on pro-life friends, think. But it's not as problematic as those people who think we couldn't exist it before twinning is no longer possible. So what some of my friends do, who are very interested in making our origins in the zygote, is they point to other creatures that can divide, but we have no reason to believe they weren't individuals before they divided. So an amoeba divides, and it's clear that amoeba existed as a substance earlier. And then they'll use the roundworm. You can divide these worms in half. You get two new worms. No one's in doubt there was a worm before. And so they say, why couldn't we then have been embryos in those first 2 weeks when twinning was still possible? And maybe we went out of existence when twinning occurred, or maybe we survived as one of the twins and the others knew. So I'll say something about both accounts, why we could have existed when twinning was possible and why it's not as obvious as my pro-life friends think. And then I'll say something about whether we could survive twinning as one of the two. All right. So the earthworm and the amoeba are not good support for the idea that there's an individual there before twinning, because the earthworm, when you divide it, it's a bloody mess. It's not designed to be broken into two. Maybe you'll get two living worms after that, maybe not immediately, but later when they repair themselves. So they're not designed to undergo that. The amoeba, on the other hand, is designed to duplicate. It would be unhealthy if it didn't fission. It kept staying alive. It would actually be a disease. It's the type of creature whose healthy function is to go out of existence and bring in two descendants. And so what happens is it duplicates all before it pinches and splits. It duplicates all its various organelles. And so it's getting ready for two. So those are not good examples for human twinning, right? Because the human twinning works differently. It works by separation. It doesn't occur at the one cell level. Maybe you can induce it, but it occurs later. And it's not a bloody mess like the worm. The worm is clearly integrated. That's why it's a bloody mess. Oozing, gross mess, major damage. But human twinning, these things just separate. They neither were prepared for that, like an amoeba, nor is it a destructive event. And the fact that it's so easy, that will then suggest it didn't have the integration that's constitutive of life. It was just a bunch of living cells and not. So the worm is not a good counterexample. You divide the worm, you really are doing destructive things to a clearly integrated entity. I don't even think they're alive right away. And they're moving, and that may mislead people. But anyway, so those are clearly individuals. Amoebas are clearly individuals designed to divide. But our twinning is not like that. So we can't necessarily point to the worm being clearly a substance, even though it can be divided. It's not naturally divided, it's imposed and violently imposed. And then the amoeba is internally designed to divide from the start. That's what its healthy culmination of its life. It would malfunction if it didn't, and it duplicates everything to have separate cells to each live their own life as amoebas. Human twinning is not like that. Maybe there's something genetic. Maybe it's more likely environmental. You see greater rates when you do IVF than natural. So it could be something in the environment. I take it people aren't that sure why. I mean, you certainly can impose it. But there you're just separating things, and that suggests they aren't that integrated. So the two standard examples of things that can twin or divide are not going to give support for the view that we were early embryos. What does give support for the view that we're early embryos, the more you learn about that early embryo, it's not just a bunch of cells kept together in the zona pellucida, each doing their own thing. There's so much integration and communication and repairs and telos and plan. It's not a flock of birds, a school of fish, as they're sometimes compared to. So the more you see, you realize there is this cooperation, this integration. Even at the two-cell stage, there's dispositions, one to be the inner cell mass, the other cell to be the origins of the blastomeres and the embryonic tissues. So there's just, the more people seem to learn about what's going on, the more integrated, complicated teleologicals. I think those are good reasons not to doubt that we have an individual there. Now, what's interesting is the very first cell. There are pro-lifers like Stone and Marquis who think, and many others who think the zygote can't grow up, as Stone put it. Because when cells divide, they go out of existence. Every cell that we know goes out of existence when it divides. But now we're saying that there's this one cell, the zygote, that then becomes a two-cell embryo, then a three-cell. So it's a very strange cell. I mean, it could be we come into existence, you might think, at the two-cell stage, because if we weren't a zygote, we have to go out of existence when it divides. That cell is gone. It is divided. So why isn't it like a skin cell in amoeba? We don't think the amoeba survives as two cells scattered. We don't think the skin cell survives as one or both of its descendants. So you have to say something. You have to give an account of why the zygote is the only cell that's not essentially a cell. Every other cell seems to be essentially a cell. When it ceases to be a cell, it goes out of existence. It doesn't become a two-cell creature. So what you have to do, here's how I would sketch it again. I'm not biologically informed enough. You can't just appeal that to zona pellucida, so there's the cell and this extra membrane, because there are cases where you get development without the zona. So we can't say the zygote divides, but there's still a composite there that includes the zygote plus this, because that need not be the case. So what you have to say is, unlike the amoeba, the embryo is preparing for a multicellular body. Everything it's doing as a zygote is getting ready for a multicellular body. It's not producing two separate zygotes. The amoeba is there to design two new amoebas. The zygote is not there to design two new zygotes. It's there to design things that will give you a multicellular body. And in fact, there's going to, even at the two-cell stage, be some dispositional differences between the two. So that's how I would respond to the worry that every other cell goes out of existence except the zygote. Zygotes are the only cell that are not essentially one-celled entities. Amoebas are essentially one-celled. Bacteria are essentially one-celled. Most organisms are one-celled, and they're essentially so. But zygotes, that is, these cells that become multicellular, dogs, cats, humans, they are not essentially one cell. So I don't think twinning is a problem. That's an interesting problem. Could we have been the zygote? Because if we were that cell, and that cell clearly seems to cease to exist when it divides, but we have to say there's one cell that can actually become a two-cell being. It's unique in that. Now, twinning is, so that's how I would argue that we could, twinning isn't a problem for us having been zygotes and early embryos. I think it's more problematic than my pro-life friends say when they use the worm and the embryo, because they're not analogous to human twinning. Then the second question I think you're interested in too is what happens to us with twinning? So there was one being and now there's two. Does the original go out of existence? And maybe if you're religious, this is even more problematic. And you have more reason for later origins, because why would God ensoul something that's going to go out of existence? Did he not know that this was going to happen? So that's a moral reason to doubt we are early embryos. So there's the biological, metaphysical reason, it doesn't have integration, constituent characteristic of life. And I've tried to sketch why that's not an issue. But you can have a moral reason. Why would God create a being that's just going to go out of existence? So maybe he wouldn't ensoul it until twinning is no longer possible. Now, you could just say this is a problem no more different than miscarriage. God's ensouling many things that are going to then miscarry and die. So if there, whatever your reason to explain miscarriage is, just help yourself to twinning. Another possibility that my wife defended, she's the hylomorphic thinker, is she says just as conjoined twins overlap extensively, maybe even earlier, before they partially divided, they completely overlap. And so there were really two zygotes there, two souls that look like one. And then nothing goes out of existence with twinning. They just separate. The four dimensionalists have a similar type of story. And then twins are not of different ages. It's not like one's going to be the original and the other's a newer ensouled being. And then there's no arbitrariness. Why did the original survive as the left rather than the right? So she thinks there were two souls all along. And if you're hylomorphic theorist, you have to change some of your beliefs. You want, because now matter can't be what's individuating. But if you have conjoined twins, and if you think there's two human beings there, you're already going to have shared matter. So you're going to need, for conjoined twins, a different theory of individuation than the standard hylomorphic one. And you can soften you up with, like, think of two roads that merge. If you're looking at the roads, you don't see two roads. You have to go a mile north to see where they had merged, or a mile south to see where they diverge. And so just that snapshot view won't tell you that's two. But, this view seems to going to have to make, or it seems more congenial to the view that twinning is ordained from the inside, and it's not an environmental issue. So there's two souls there. They are going to separate. We don't want a single body with two souls going all through life. And it may be, though, that twinning is more environmentally imposed than internally composed. I don't think people really know what causes twinning, although they obviously can induce twinning. You can deliberately do this with not done it with non-human embryos. So you think you could do it with human, just morally not permit it. So it's an interesting question whether that will solve the problem. And that's a very controversial metaphysics, my wife, two souls there. So that's why no one goes out of existence. Other people think with asymmetrical twinning, like one is, you have 14 cells, two go to one cell, two cells go to the right, the other 12 stay. And then the original stays, just like when you do like budding or cloning or cut a plant apart. But then it gets interesting if symmetrical fission. Why think one survives with symmetrical fission? Leaving souls apart now. If there was a soul, there would be a mereological difference. This one has the original soul, this one doesn't. But let's leave the soul theory behind. And we have perfect symmetrical fission. We have 7 cells go right. Of the 14-cell embryo, 7 left. So a lot of people think it's just a fact of the matter. But I don't like these sort of free-floating facts, brute identity. It seems like the world could have been possible world. The original could have gone right rather than left. Could have been the embryo on the right rather than left. And then if you do this with fusion, where you say sometimes the entity on the left survives fusion, sometimes the entity on the right survives fusion, then we don't have informative persistent conditions. We'll get identical embryos. Some will survive fusion, some won't. So I don't want identity floating free. I don't want there just to be a brute fact that we don't know. That to me seems to leave something unexplained, to violate the principle of sufficient reason or something like that. I want a story. Why? So I'm inclined to say at twinning, the original goes out of existence. If I was, I think if there was on the lighter side, a metaphysically sophisticated card company, you have congratulation cards for children and you have sympathy cards for miscarriage or death. You need a congrapathy card because you've lost one child and you've gained another. I don't think that card will sell well. Only in a very metaphysically sophisticated college town would you be able to sell a congrapathy card. But I'm inclined to think it goes out of existence. And here's part of the reason. I don't want to say, it's not just because I don't like brute facts and the symmetrical fission, it'll be left. I think even asymmetrical fission will often go out of existence. The reason is the follow, is that half of those cells of the embryo that's about to divide, they are parts. They are not an organism. They are functioning as a part. So like a plant cutting, when you cut that branch off, that branch doesn't immediately become an organism. There has to be communication. There's a temporal gap. The parts of that branch have to say, to do it anthropomorphized, we've got to start growing roots and doing what organisms do. We can't do what parts do. So I think that's got to be true of twinning. When there's immediate division of the 14-celled embryo into 7 cells, or 28 into 14, what have you. I don't think those parts are immediately composing an organism. They have to reconfigure themselves. There has to be some communication. I don't even think that the earthworms are immediately earthworms. They move, so we're misled. But I think those parts, there has to be some communication. They have to say to each other, communicate to each other, we've got to start doing other things than we did. I don't think they're immediately maimed organisms. They're not immediately alive and damaged. So I suspect it's almost an a priori argument. There's got to be a temporal gap where parts reorganize themselves. It can't be like instantly they're organisms doing what's characteristic of life. I don't even think, I guess you could say they have a disposition there, but I don't want to say they're yet living organisms. They have to rearrange. They have to stop acting like parts and stop acting. So I think twinning, if it's symmetrical, will be death. And I think asymmetrical, if it's, 24, 23 cells, for one-way twin, I bet that's death of both of them. It's only if it's going to be like 24 cells and 2, when the 26 cell embryo becomes a 24 cell, those 2 cells were redundant to life. It's like losing your finger. Your life will withdraw and your life process will cover left material. But there was enough that the life process were there without the finger contributing. So they didn't need the finger. So you can lose finger and you get smaller and life processes, in a sense, recede. And so maybe some budding, if it was like that, really asymmetrical, you would survive it. But if it's barely asymmetrical, 24 cells, 23, I think those 2 things can't immediately be organisms. They can't be doing what's characteristic of organisms. Now, I'm open to being told otherwise because this is armchair biology. This is a metaphysician just saying, from the little I know about twinning, I don't think these things can immediately be organisms. If organisms have to interact in a certain way. So I suspect symmetrical twinning and maybe even some asymmetrical twinning is death. And it won't even help if you're a 4-dimensionalist, because sure, there's going to be a thing that persists. There's one entity that had these temporal parts and then those, but a 4-dimensional organism will die. 4-dimensional organism still has to do what a 3-dimensional organism do. It has to integrate itself. So 4-dimensionalists, while they have, this unrestricted composition, they're going to say there's an entity there that was 28 cells and then 14. But I don't think it was alive when it went from 28 to 14. It had to do something, just as the 3-dimensional organism had to do something for its parts to become non-parts. And I think there's a temporal gap there. That's my hunch. Again, it's armchair metaphysics, speculating about biology, which is a little biological information, but I'm very skeptical of one surviving twinning and just being a brute fact. Which one you did, I don't. Skeptical of identity being a brute fact. And I'm skeptical on biological grounds that there's just life processes there. So
I must say this is a very different approach than most pro-lifers would take in academics. They seem to want to keep the intuition that perhaps we just split, that there was one and then another one.
Right.
Sort of popped out.
And so no one died, someone's new. That may be the account. I'm just worried about if fission was symmetrical. It's hard to take the budding thing. That's when you're going to start getting this primitive identity fact. And like I said, what's true of fission should be true of fusion. I certainly don't think you want to say sometimes lefty survives fusion and sometimes it doesn't. That's just very strange.
I have to say I am very impressed by this approach, and it's not something that I see most of the time. And sort of what kind of makes me think is, well, perhaps like when the zygote splits, there are kind of these buttons that are like pressed when, something was keeping them together and now they're split away. Now, as you said, sort of the previous parts now have to work in a different way. So kind of different disposition is activated. Well, oh no, we have to reconfigure our entire system in order to now function independently. And I don't think that's really a bad approach. I think that kind of it might be pretty pretty supported by our biological research.
Yeah, I need to know more. I don't think you can just help yourself to the disposition being there to count as an organism, because that disposition was there before the division. We could still say that those half had that disposition. We don't want to say they're organisms then. So we have to see a detailed account of what's going on with twinning. Problem is when I try to read anything biological, that given my metaphysical interest, they're not interested in my puzzles. So they're not throwing up this information. Like I also wonder whether some things like the abortion pill, if they're actually killing rather than letting die the fetus, is it actually destroying the placenta that's intertwined in the uterine wall, or is it just sort of more like unplugging the violinist? So I'm not sure. When you destroy the uterine wall or detach it, that might be like, when you dig up a sidewalk with the roots, you're destroying the roots. It may more be like choking someone than choking the esophagus than pulling away a life tube. And I try to read on these things, but the biologists, they don't care about my philosophical puzzles, whether correctly described as letting die or killing. Are we destroying the placenta, which I assume is a part of the embryo, or are we just cutting off its life support, like the violinist? And it's always frustrating. I don't have the time and energy to go as deep into the science literature I like, but I need to eventually to get to these answers.
So I think this was a lovely response and definitely an interesting one. But personally, I think the reason I was most skeptical of animalism was definitely the objection from conjoined twins.
That's
And
great.
that struck me like immediately when I first heard the objection. I was like, oh, I don't know what to do here. And especially when I read the Alexander Boyle's paper, where because first I wanted to say, oh, well, they're just gonna well, there are two animals that they're like
right,
sort of
partially separate.
And Ben Vegan says they're like fixed together or bumped together.
Yeah.
And then she goes over and says, well, it's really, really hard to take that approach as pretty much every way that we try to individuate organisms, they're going to end up being a single organism. And by our intuitions, they're going to end up being two persons. So specifically, the one I'm talking about is the Dicephalus case, but there's also the I think Cephalopegas case where the twins are connected with their cerebrums or maybe called heads.
That's fascinating.
And I think she even says that might even be a voice sort of example.
I was her referee the first two times she submitted it to Analysis Australasian. I said R&R, and both times they disregarded. And then it got into Phil's studies. The Cephalopegas one isn't a problem for the analysts. On her account, I actually got her to realize that McMahon thinks this is a problem because there's one cerebrum and two bodies, two brain stems. And so if there's two animals there, then there have to be two persons, two thinkers. But we want to say there's just one thinker, one cerebrum. So the animalists would have a too many thinkers problem. And animalists love to say about their rivals, you have a too many thinker problems because you have the animal and the person. And now, touche. But on her account, it's just one animal, metabolically, homeostatically. So there would only be one person there. Looks like there's two animals because there's just the only thing that's shared cerebrum. But so her account on individuation is actually devastating for that point of McMahon. It just gets rid of that as a counterexample. This is not a too many thinkers problem for the animal because there's just one animal there on these accounts of individuation. But the Dicephalus is fascinating. And you can't even make the claim, even if Boyle was wrong, and you could argue these were partially separate organisms. Matthew Lau does that, Robbie George, Patrick Lee. McMahon has a graduate student, Mark Reed, who just had a counterexample that it can't be treated as partially separate organisms. And that's where you, from birth, if not earlier, you alternate anesthetized in hemispheres. So the left hemisphere Monday is anesthetized, and then Tuesday, the right hemisphere is anesthetized. So they have completely separate minds, just like the Dicephalus, but this is within a single brain. Two completely cut off mental lives, as distinct as yours is from mine, no communication, no causal interaction. The only way they can ever infer what the other had been thinking is inferentially, like, see what they said, watch a film, look at their body, and things like that. So that by itself will undermine the attempt to say that these are separately are partially separated organisms. And there's another case McMahon gives of where you have this parasitical cephalopogus, where there's just like a head that's absorbed, might literally be a part. It's not usually attached to the person's head, and they usually die, but it may actually be sentient itself, and it's clearly not an organism. It's just a head. It has no body, not a partially separated body. It's a parasite, completely sustained by the other. But anyway, the Mark Reed one's great. You just alternate anesthetize, and there's no way an analyst can say those are partially separated animals. You can't separate an animal by cutting the corpus callosum. Or actually, you didn't even cut the corpus callosum. You just anesthetize. There's not even any cutting. You just anesthetize two halves of the brain, and you get completely different streams of consciousness, just like the dicephalus, but within a single head. And so that will give you the same intuitions as the dicephalus. These are two separate people, two completely different lives, different thoughts, beliefs, values, intentions, and so forth. And no more two organisms than we say if you cut off a finger, you've got two organisms. So you can't even make that the standard, well, not standard, but the response that a lot of animals want to make. Okay, so what can you say? Well, one thing, if you're a Christian and a classical Christian, and you have a view of the Trinity, you have an analogy here. So the Trinity, in some sense, is three distinct persons in some sense, right? And they're also the same substance in some sense, the same divine substance. So three persons who are distinct persons in some sense, has to be spelled out, it's real tricky, who are the same divine substance. So now the dicephalus can be, if you have a good model of that, what do you say about the dicephalus is there are two persons who are distinct in some sense, but they are the same animal substance. And if you're worried about abortion, you think the dicephalus shows we're essentially thinking beings, we never were fetus. Well, if the two dicephalic persons were the same animal substance, then they were both there in the womb as mindless animals. William Craig Lane actually has an analog of the Trinity where he uses the hound of Hades, the Cerberus, this three-headed hound of Hades. And so it's sort of a tricephalus. So if you thought you could explain the Trinity in a coherent way, you could use that model for the dicephalus, and these two distinct persons would be the same animal, however you do that, relative identity, whatever your theory is. But, many people who aren't theists, and even some theists think this is explaining the obscure with the more obscure. Dicephalus is obscure, the nature of God is even more, the Trinitarian theism is even more obscure, so not much help. So I'll try some different strategies. One, this will also be a solution to the transplant intuition. So maybe if you were going to ask that later, the transplant case, I'll come back to this and just point out how it helps with the dicephalus. So I won't do that now. So what I'll do is try to say we're misled in the dicephalic case by two heads, two faces. We just associate heads with persons, faces, person. But we can be brought through some analogies, some thought experiments, and some real cases to see this is really one person with a divided mind. So there's one animal and one person with a divided mind. I don't want to make exceptions and say some persons are small parts of animals, but you and I aren't. I think McMahon, Parfit are right. Whatever's true for that dicephalus should be true for us. If dicephalic persons are small parts of the animal, then you and I are small parts of an animal. It would be very weird. I mean, imagine a transplant of a dicephalic brain into another body. It would stay small. But your brain, you would go from really large to small during transport and then large again. That makes no sense. That your brain is just temporarily a small person, then you become a normal sized person after the transplant, just as you were a normal sized person before. Very implausible. Anyway, so here's what I'll do. I'll first come up with cases where we have neurologically distinct and psychologically distinct thought. And our intuition is there's just one person there, one animal. And so if I can get illicit intuitions in these 5 cases, maybe, where you think you would have prudential concern for your animal, despite not having any neurological continuity or psychological continuity with it, then I can say you should also have prudential concern if you were one of the dicephalic persons for the other dicephalic person, because you really are the same person and animal. So the dicephalists, they're neurologically distinct and psychologically distinct. So that's why we think, or people may think they're two people. So I will again give you some examples where you have prudential concern for a being that is not neurologically continuous with us. Very different neurons are producing thoughts, and it's not psychologically continuous with you. You don't have your memory. It doesn't have your memories, beliefs, desires, and so on. Nonetheless, you have this concern, and so your concern has to be based on that being the same animal as you. So here's the first one. It's a variant of sleeping Socrates and waking Socrates. So sleeping Socrates is completely cut off from waking Socrates, has nightmares, and can't draw any content from its sleeping life, waking life. And when you wake up, unlike a normal nightmare where you're exhausted, tired, anxious, you're fresh and fine. You're completely cut off. There's actually, say, some damage that stopped your dream life from ever being accessible to your waking life. So sleeping Socrates has these nightmares, or you, pretending you're sleeping Socrates, have these nightmares, and they have no psychological or neurological connections with your waking life. When you're awake, you can't remember your nightmares, and it's even a slightly different part of the brain. There's like been something's been cut. So your nightmares can't form memories of your waking life. So here we have neurologically distinct thinkers, psychologically distinct thinkers, but with one head and one face. So we're not going to be, perhaps there's no distortional feature there, one head and one face. And then so when you're awake, or say Socrates sees a video of his body groaning, grimacing, moving about, look like it's just tormented. And then there's wires that say, oh, this is REM sleep, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't you have prudential concern if say you were in that position, watching a film of your sleeping animal, miserable, they're having nightmares, by all scientific evidence, having terrible nightmares, crying, groaning, grimacing. Okay. Wouldn't you have prudential concern? A concern for that being that you don't have if you watch the film of me. I mean, no one wants anyone to have nightmares, but your concern for your animal's nightmares seem a lot different than your concern if you heard someone that you've never met who lives in Algeria had nightmares. So it seems like if that's your reaction, you would have some special prudential concern rather than just a generic concern for anyone's well-being, for strangers. That is for a being that you are not neurologically connected with or psychologically connected with. What you are, it is the same animal. It's the same animal as waking Socrates, sleeping Socrates, the same animal. I think it's Socrates, sleep and wake, just two different states. So if you have that prudential concern, I don't know if you do, if you watch these videos of your animal, miserable nightmares, and there's something you could do to prevent the nightmares, where the person has pleasant dreams, whatever, you would do it. And you would do it out of prudential concern. So then if you can have prudential concern for sleeping Socrates or for sleeping Ivan, waking Ivan has concern for sleeping Ivan, in the absence of neurological and psychological continuity, why shouldn't the dicephalic twin with one head have prudential concern for the twin and the other? Say, that's me thinking. I'm thinking both those thoughts. It's just when I'm thinking these thoughts with this head, I have no causal interaction with these thoughts with that other head. It's just like you don't have any causal interaction with thoughts from when you were a baby, but they are still your thoughts. So that's my first example. The second thing I'm going to do is say, look, even the McMahon and Parfit have to say there's an animal there with a split mind, divided mind, right? Well, they want to say there's two persons there. They certainly believe there's only one animal there. The whole thing wouldn't work if there wasn't. And why isn't that animal thinking with each its brain? So you're committed to a being. If you have this embodied mind view, you're committed to there being a being with two heads whose thoughts are cut off from each other. So if you're going to admit that about your animal, why not treat people like animals? Just as animals can have divided thoughts, it's not impossible for a thinking being to have thoughts cut off from other thoughts. Why not say that about the person? So what McMahon will come back and say is the animal doesn't really think in a non-derivative sense. He has this great analogy of the car is noisy because the horn's noisy. The horn's the real noisemaker, and because it's apart, we say the car's noisy, but it's just a derivative noise. It's not non-derivative. It's not a noisemaker. So you want to say the brain's the real thought maker, thought producer, not the animal. Is the animal just a derivative thinker? So he can say, all right, Dave, your dicephalus is an organism with two brains, but it's not non-derivatively producing thoughts cut off from themselves. It just has these derivative thoughts. But the whole derivative, non-derivative fails, collapses. So just, let's say the minimal thinker is roughly the cerebrum, maybe a little more. There are entities bigger than cerebrum that can become cerebrum size. So the brain can be reduced in size, the cerebrum, and any other entity, maybe we haven't even given it a name, bigger than the cerebrum, smaller than the organism. I mean, some people think the organism can become brain size, even cerebrum size, but let's say that's not the case. There's still going to be other things like the brain that can become cerebrum size. And the cerebrum can become left hemisphere size. So if the brain became cerebrum size, the brain would be atom for atom, the same as cerebrum. It just lost some parts. McMahon and Parfit don't want to say no one can lose any parts. We're not neurological essentialists. So then that animal would be a non-derivative thinker when it became cerebrum size. So again, we have two thinkers in the same place, which they were trying to avoid anyway. So they merely pushed the metaphysical lump in the carpet or lump in the metaphysical carpet. So they haven't solved that puzzle. They're going to actually need a very sparse ontology. There's no such thing as brains or anything else that can become thinker size. And that's a terrible ontology, terrible cost, worse than the sparse ontology of the animals. So anyway, what the point I want to make is when this derivative thinker becomes a non-derivative thinker, so the brain becomes cerebrum sized. Let's say we replace the amputated parts of the brain that had been lost. So the brain then becomes as big as it was before and becomes bigger than the cerebrum. The cerebrum becomes a part of the brain. They're no longer co-located. The brain's not going to cease to think. Derivative thought will be real thought. Just like if your heart is pathological disease, you're diseased. So you can derivatively have a real disease in virtually your part. You're touching the floor because your foot is, but you're really touching the floor. So I think derivative thought, like a derivative disease, like if I have a pathological back, I'm injured, I'm diseased, I'm pathological, I'm genuinely pathological because my back's pathological, or your heart, lungs. So I think derivative thought is real thought. And that brain, when it becomes a non-derivative thinker, it doesn't cease to become a thinker when you just start adding parts. Nothing could lose the ability to think by just adding things, right? That's crazy. So I think go back to Dicephalus, if there are two persons there, they're brain size, there's also an animal that can think, and that animal has a divided mind. So you already have an ontology where you accept creatures with divided minds, or two minds. It doesn't matter. That's a notational difference. I prefer divided mind because we associate persons with minds. I'd rather have a person with a divided mind than there being a person with two minds. But anyway, it's a notational difference. So I think McMahon's already committed to there being beings with a divided mind. So he can't use that lack of neurological and psychological continuity to argue we have two persons here. He's got to admit the animal has a divided mind, and that animal can think with that divided mind. It's genuine thought. So that's my second response. The third is, for all we know, this could be true of fetuses. They start thinking at 5 months. The brain's developed. So that's a general view. It doesn't matter if it's off one way or the other. The examples still work. And for all we know, these beings who are not self-conscious, there's minimally sentient. There's pain due to one part of the brain and then pleasure due to another. And later, sometime after birth, when they become self-conscious, they can have thoughts like the following: I'm in pain now. I remember this contented state of being pain-free. I hope that returns. We're not going to think there were two thinkers in the fetus who then fused and became a new entity who was self-conscious and could own both those painful thoughts and those pleasant thoughts. We're going to say all along there was an animal there that was having pleasant thoughts, completely neurologically and psychologically cut off from its unpleasant thoughts. It was the same thinker. There were not two thinkers there. So here we have something like a Dicephalus, but within a single brain. For all we know, different parts of the brain are producing thought, and none of us are going to say there were two thinkers there. But McMahon has to be committed to two thinkers, and then he has to be committed to self-consciousness being a fusion case. And he has to tell something about fusion. The most likely story, again, is it's a new entity. And so if we can say a fetus has painful thoughts that are neurologically and psychologically cut off from its pleasant thoughts, right? Remember, it's a minimally conscious being. It just has painful states, pleasant states. It has no ability to recall them, and they have no causal impact on each other. They're not affecting each other. There's some moments of pain, followed some moments of pleasure. Pains and pleasures don't float free. Someone has them, the organism has them. There's not two thinkers there. Otherwise, we're gonna have those things going out of existence when they do become causally integrated. When there is a thinker who can go, oh yeah, thank God that pain is over and now it's pleasant. I hope it doesn't come back. So again, if you have that intuition that this is just one thinker, with neurologically and psychologically discontinuous thoughts, why not treat the dicephalus? How to respond to Mark Reed's case. This is the fascinating one where you just alternate and anesthetize heads. So I have this idea, and my graduate student gave me a methodology to support it. But my idea was, it isn't the psychological discontinuity and the neurological discontinuity why we're saying there are two people there in the alternating anesthesia. What's driving the case is that they're just, the values and thoughts and beliefs are just so different. You can't take ownership of them. They seem to be heteronymous rather than autonomous. There's no narrative. So let's change the story. Because the people are in the same environment and they're neurologically, or, genetically the same, they end up with the alternating anesthesia with the exact same goals, the exact same friends, exact same lovers, same hobbies. I just had stipulated this, and my graduate student, Sean Kenya, said, imagine instead of alternating days, we just alternate seconds. And so every experience of everyone you come across, first, like split second, it's the left hemisphere forming the memory, then the right. I mean, to make it so quick, there's not even, you're not even missing out on a word. So, but that we do then still have two neurologically discontinuous and psychologically discontinuous beings. They just have the exact same friends, the exact same values, exact same intentions, qualitatively, exact same hopes, but they're neurologically distinct and there's not psychologically continuous in the sense there's no causal interaction between. Then ask yourself, when the right hemisphere is anesthetized and the individual's thinking with the left hemisphere, would he really not have any concern for the being tomorrow or moments later that will be thinking with the right hemisphere who has the exact same body, exact same friends, same goals? So I'm suggesting what's making us unable to identify the Mark Reed case as a single person is not the psychological discontinuity, and it's not the neurological discontinuity. It's not that it's different brain stuff, but it's the difference in the values and the beliefs and the goals and the friends. It's just not a narrative. It doesn't seem autonomous. Doesn't seem to be your values. So I think my hunch is you can neutralize that. And so look, if the person with the left hemisphere can care prudentially about the person with the right hemisphere, even though they're always alternating, why not again extend that lesson to dicephalus? It doesn't look like neurological. Two more intuitions. One is most of us think with a stroke we could survive becoming minimally sentient, no longer rational or self-conscious. That would be us. You do one of these future pain prudential concern tests, it's going to be great pain. How much would you pay to avoid it? Obviously more than you would for a person in Timbuktu. That's going to be you. Now let's imagine after the stroke you go into a coma. And you come out of that coma minimally sentient, but in virtue of the plasticity of the brain, a very different part of your neurology, never before played any role in producing thought, will have those pleasant and painful intuitions. If you have prudential concern for a being that you are not neurologically or psychologically continuous with, that's because you're an animal. That bit of the brain, given the plasticity, that's part of you because it's caught up in your animal's life. And so if you can have concern for a merely sentient state of your animal that involves a part of the brain that never before produced thought until the stroke and the coma, plasticity, then again, why couldn't the dicephalus have concern for its thoughts that are neurologically and psychologically distinct? So these are all examples trying to get you to have some prudential concern for a being you're not neurologically and psychologically continuous with, but is the same animal, which suggests that prudential concern is concern for your animal, not for your psychology and your neurology. It's not concern for your brain-sized person. It's concern for your animal. The last example would be, again, these are my intuitions. They may not be shared. My intuitions may be so corrupted by my theoretical commitments. So, could really use some X-Fi here. But here's the case. Imagine a 4-month-old fetus. So its cerebrum is almost ready to produce thought, but not yet. And then doctors do sonograms or some other sort of investigative procedure. And they go, that cerebrum is very unhealthy. It'll just produce cat, dog-like thoughts, never impressive thoughts. But we can treat it. We can do a procedure that will just transform it greatly, and it'll be a normal cerebrum. But they're going to transform so much of the matter of that cerebrum, it'll be a new cerebrum. And so, given McMahon's view that the person's a cerebrum, it's going to be, when there is a mind, there's not a person yet, but when there is one, it'll be a different person than if we hadn't done the surgery. My view is do the surgery. You have just cured my kid. You have not given me a different kid. I think my kid's been cured. And the thing I like about this 4-month-old fetus is there's no psychology there to distract us. If the creature had a psychology and then the surgery removed that psychology, you'd be a little more pulled, I think, or just influenced to say it was a different one. I think you can be misled by psychological continuity. It's been lost. If it's lost, you're more likely to say it's a different person. But if it was never there in the first place, I think most parents' intuition is they have cured their kid. Not that they now have a different kid. It's not like they conceived again after a miscarriage. It's not like a miscarriage and then conceiving again. You have cured your kid. But there's no neurological continuity between that damaged cerebrum and the repaired cerebrum is really a new cerebrum. No continuity between that. And so these are all intuitions to suggest you have concern for yourself or concern for someone else. I mean, our attitude is that's good for my son to get a new cerebrum. It's not good for me. I mean, it's also good for me. Now I have a very bright son instead of a not so bright son, but it's the same son. It's not a different one. So if you have those intuitions, I think we can undermine the appeal of the dicephalus. And when we talk about transplants, I'll give you some different arguments. If we accept the view that identity doesn't matter, which I don't, then it's even easier to undermine the dicephalus. Did that make any sense? Did you have any of those intuitions?
Honestly, the last one is definitely, I think it struck me as pretty, it struck me. I'm like very surprised by this. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
And honestly, I do share that intuition, honestly. It does seem like.
What about the case of your sleeping Socrates?
The sleeping Socrates.
You want to stop having nightmares?
I'm not sure about that one. I think the one
might just be a generic concern that no one has a nightmare.
I think my concern is whether we're really sort of disconnected in that case, whether the awake Socrates is sort of. I'm unsure if we're that disconnected from our sleeping states.
Right. Well, I'm trying to stipulate there was a neurological accident.
Yeah.
So that's why when you wake up, you're not exhausted, you're not drained, and you don't even have glimpses. It's really cut off. I just like the fact that it's all within one head and one face, which itself could be distorting us. I mean, maybe they're misleading us. I'm trying to say 2 heads and 2 faces may mislead us. We're just going to think there's 2 persons. But what we have here is the same thing the dicephalus, neurologically distinct thoughts. They have no common basis neurologically, and psychologically, causally unconnected thoughts. I'm just trying to appeal that people would have a concern for their sleeping, nightmarish animal, and that suggests they're animals.
The one I did find very interesting was the one where you mentioned that the let's say 5-month-old fetus is has one part of the brain is experiencing pleasure, the other pain, and if they really are disconnected in the sense that you're saying, then that is really striking my intuition. And yeah, there really is
another market for my concrapathy card, where those 2 fetal individuals are going to go out of existence when they fuse. So sympathy, and then congratulations on your new kid. You've lost 2. Unlike twinning, you've lost 1 and you're up 1. Here you're down 1. You got a new kid, but you've lost 2. So you should probably be sadder than with twinning. Fusion's more depressing than twinning.
Yeah, it would be. But yeah, those are definitely. I never heard of those, so they're definitely struck my intuition, in a different way.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably good if we just go right into brain transplant, because I want it to be more connected so that we can just enter it
right
the best way possible.
Okay. So the first thing I would say, if you are transplanted with your cerebrum, that's the dominant intuition. You tell your students your cerebrum switches into another body, make it a similar body so there's not confusion, switching sexes and ages, like a clone. And the being with your cerebrum will have all your thoughts, memories, secrets that you've never told anyone. There's a powerful intuition. You switched bodies. But look at the cost of that view. If we're going to use this thought experiment to teach us about metaphysics, that means prior to the transplant, the person was co-located with the animal and distinct from the animal. The person was, 6 feet, 180, then became very small cerebrum size, and then became 6 feet, 180 again. So then you have this terrible metaphysical quandary. Before the transplant, you had a person using the brain to think, the animal using the brain to think, and we had too many thinkers. So those are your costs. You can try to avoid that by saying animals don't think. Sidney Shoemaker says that. Good luck, not going to work. You can try to do it like McMahon that says, really, they weren't co-located like constitution theorists. The person was a small part, but I've already suggested that's not going to solve the too many thinker problems, because not only can the brain become cerebrum sized, the cerebrum can then become left hemisphere size. And, you destroy the right hemisphere, the cerebrum gets smaller and it's co-located. And now you have two thinkers again. So the costs are great. So even if you have these intuitions, give them up. Second thing to say is use my example from the dicephalus. After the stroke, you're reduced to minimal sentience, but with a different part of the brain. If you have concern, if you're told ahead of time, this is what's going to happen, and that the plasticity of the brain, there's going to be terrible torments. Do you have prudential concern? If you do, then you have a way to resist the transplant. So imagine instead of a transplant, it's a swap. And most people's intuition is, I have prudential concern for where my cerebrum goes. I don't care at all about my body with the new cerebrum, right? But if you had concern in my stroke case for your animal with neurology due to plasticity, a different part of the brain producing thoughts it never did before, then you should also have prudential concern for the recipient of the brain transplant. And you can't have prudential concern both for your animal with a new brain and prudential concern for a different animal with your old brain. So that's one way to try to suggest we have prudential concern for animals. And something has to give. We can then do big metaphysics, say who has the better theory overall in terms of composition, questions about too many thinkers, puzzles, vagueness, whatever else is influencing your account of personal identity. We can somewhat neutralize that. Granted, the brain transplant is very powerful, but if you have prudential concern for a different part of your brain that never before played a role in thought, why is that part of you? Well, it's caught up in your life, your animal life process. Then you should also have prudential concern for your future, in which you get a new cerebrum. Or, as I said, if you have concern for the sake of your 4-month-old fetus, that it's get a new cerebrum before it's even thinking, it just get a better cerebrum than it would otherwise have. That again suggests prudential concern for your animal, or it suggests concern for your child as an animal. It's not prudential concern, but it's concern for your child's sake, your animal, biological animal child. You think that would be good for them to get a new cerebrum. So good for them in this case at 4 months old to get a new cerebrum. Why, if let's say their cerebrum was destroyed in their persistent vegetative state, why wouldn't it be good for them to get a new cerebrum later? Why would it not be good for them then? The last thing you can say, this isn't my strategy, but I'll use a bit of it, is you take Parfit's famous lesson, identity doesn't matter. You take this fission case. The two hemispheres are each separated. They're both transplanted. If it hadn't been for the presence of the right hemisphere, you would be the person with the left hemisphere. And if you hadn't been for the presence of the left hemisphere, let's say it had been destroyed in this process, you would have switched bodies and had the person with the right hemisphere. But when we have a double transplant, Parfit goes, this is not as bad as death. Both of these beings have your memories, thoughts, desires, intentions. They'll do what you were going to do, and they can now do it at the same time. And so his famous lesson is identity isn't what matters. What matters is psychological continuity and connection. So Olson then comes back and says, look, in the fission case, our concern for the beings that were psychologically continuous, it doesn't tell us anything about identity, because we can't be both of them if they're distinct. So then Olson goes, let's just take a whole cerebrum transplant. That too should tell us nothing about identity. It should just tell us about what we're concerned about, as we should be concerned, the being who has our cerebrum, but we shouldn't be concerned for ourselves, perhaps with a new cerebrum if it was a swap. Okay. So if that was correct, if identity didn't matter, then you can just undermine the brain transplant. You can just say, look, fission has what matters, this fission in double transplant. We could have survived with just one hemisphere, maybe we'd be Maine, but we could have survived with one hemisphere and you could transplant that, we would be transplanted. So why think we go with our whole cerebrum? Sure, what matters to us is found over here. But look, even when we didn't exist in the fission case, what matters to us was found in these two places. So it doesn't tell us anything. And so if what matters doesn't tell you about an identity, going back to Dicephalus, what doesn't matter to us doesn't tell us anything about who we're not identical to. So if the one Dicephalus didn't care about the other, because there's no psychological continuity, we can't draw from that lack of concern that there's a lack of identity. The Dicephalus with the left hemisphere may be, the left with the brain on the left may just be the same animal and same person as the Dicephalus with the right head. Abigail Hensel and Brittany Hensel, the famous case, are the same. So just to summarize, if what matters can't tell us about identity, then what doesn't matter can't tell us about the absence of identity. So if Parfit's right, ironically, he and McMahon can't use the Dicephalus and our lack of concern, each head's lack of concern for the other, to argue they're not the same being, because concern doesn't track identity. But I don't believe that view, that identity doesn't matter. So I can't help myself to that. But if you do have that view, if you can take Parfit's and McMahon's own view and say, here's how I deal with the transplants. That's what Olson did in his early book, The Human Animal. He just said, everything that matters to us has been transplanted, but we stay behind. Thought's not essential to us. And then I think he makes even a similar argument when he does take up these conjoined twin cases. He said, again, the fact that we don't care, the animal, when its left head is thinking, doesn't care about the animal with its right head is thinking certain thoughts, that they're cut off from each other, doesn't tell us that it's not the same animal and person. But what I would want to say, even though I don't believe that identity doesn't matter, I think identity does matter. If you're not identical to somebody, you should care less in this prudential way. Maybe you could care more in other ways. I care more about my children and myself, but it's not prudential concern. Still, I think since psychological continuity and identity in every case we know are coextensive, it's going to influence us. So even if identity isn't what matters, and so I don't have as strong an argument as Olson. You just say transplant tells us nothing because our intuitions about what matters are unrelated to identity. I don't think that's true. That's why I gave you all the examples in Dicephalus, where I'm trying to get you to have a prudential concern or concern for another animal for the animal's sake. I still think it can influence us. And so we can be misled by there being a being psychologically continuous with us. And so I still would say that we can be misled in the transplant case by our concern, even though I don't want to say concern and identity have nothing to do with each other. I believe identity does matter. It's a necessary condition for me to have prudential concern that I'm identical to this being. I can't have prudential concern for being I'm not. So that's how I would respond, different ways to the thought experiment. I guess the strongest is just say, look at the cost. Maybe we should live with this recalcitrant intuition that we go with our cerebrum. Now, other people think animals can become cerebrum sized. With some of the hylomorphic thinkers like Proust and Ebro think that. And even a non-hylomorphic thinker like Roy Madden thinks the animal's characteristic activities are thought, and it can cease to do these living things. But then you just have, it all falls apart on the transplant into a vegetative. So in the hylomorphic tradition, there's still a person there in a persistent vegetative state. Their mental capacities are blocked, but the same soul is keeping them alive, the soul that would enable them to think. So grandma's still there. And if grandpa can become cerebrum size, because his mental capacities are generated by the soul, and there's no life processes when he's cerebrum size, but those powers are still there. Capacities are still there. So you transplant grandpa's cerebrum into grandma's body, all hell breaks loose. Now we're going to have grandma's using grandpa's brain to think, grandpa's using grandma's body to stay alive. We have too many thinkers, too many puzzles. So you do not want to be an animalist who believes in transplants. This is the problem with these hybrid theories that say either condition sufficient life or thought. You then have a disaster when you have a living being in a persistent vegetative state, and you have a thinking being cerebrum size. You put them together. This is not chocolate and peanut butter making a delicious Reese's cup. It's a metaphysical nightmare. So I'm worried that hylomorphic, especially the Thomistic survivalists, they're the ones who think the animal survives in purgatory with a single part. If you can go into purgatory without a body, why can't you be transplanted without your body? And so it's, one's a miraculous, the other's not, but these are problems. So I don't think an animalist can help themselves to transplant case. So anyway, that's my.
Yeah. So not a huge fan of domestic polymorphism in particular. I tend to go on a bit more different tradition, especially one which is more closely related to people like Robert Koons, Anna Marmondoro, William Jaworski, um, and thinkers that maybe even Kit Fine. I tend to find those more attractive than something like Jeffrey Browers or David Oldenburg's. They tend to be a bit more optimistic in that sense. So yeah, I think it would really depend upon which tradition you go with here. Um, but yeah, those were definitely interesting responses, and I haven't given much thought myself on this. Um, but I could honestly go either way. I'm I'm really I don't have a concrete answer for this. It seems pretty difficult, at least to me. But I do like your responses, and especially I like that you're way more dynamic in the sense that you are willing to accept some things which might not seem uh, they're a bit less dogmatic, I should say.
It's a
Um,
powerful intuition, the transplant.
yeah, absolutely.
And certainly, when I first read it, I was convinced.
But I do have a bit of a question that's more a bit. I don't think it's been brought up much, but there are a couple people who've have said that um, if we take like a domestic perspective, then substances obviously cannot have other substances as proper parts. So it kind of gets into a difficult position where if we imagine a pregnant person, a mother, who is attached to her baby, and if we take like a Van Wagen's approach where life gets caught into life, so everything which is part of a life is essentially one thing, and we get into sort of a problem here. At least they say that we in this case we have a single organism, either a mother or a fetus, and the other one is just a part of the other, or they're just meshed up together. And I think the one of the people who brought this up was Anna Mackenzie. I think she has a book on this specifically on the metaphysics of pregnancy. But I would, if you do have any thoughts on this, I would really like
Yeah.
to hear them because
Elsa Kingma has been pushing this line to, I think more than anyone else, the fetus is a part of the mother. I'm the only pro-lifer who thinks this would be great news if the fetus was a part. All the other pro-lifers are so afraid. They want it to be a thing. I think they're thinking, well, if it's a part of the mother can do what she wants with her parts. I think that's their worry. Then there's a more metaphysical worry that it's not going to be an organism. If they're organisms within organisms, organisms as parts of it. But I think it would, as a pro-lifer, I think this would be great. I'm the only pro-lifer who hopes fetuses are parts of their mother. Why do I hope that? Well, then 3 arguments for abortion are false on merely conceptual grounds. You don't even have to do any moral heavy lifting about value, status, dignity, interest. So if the fetus is a part of the mother, it can't trespass. Your arm can't trespass on your body. You may not like your nose, an ethnic nose, but it's not going to be a trespasser. Even more importantly, the fetus can't violate the mother's bodily integrity. There are entire books written. Eileen McDonough has one about abortion as a defense of bodily integrity. This thing is penetrate your body, taking over your bodies, changing, transforming your body. If any born person did this to another, put their hand or body part in another's body, would be clearly a terrible violation of bodily integrity, and you could defend yourself lethally. But if the fetus is a part, it cannot violate the mother's bodily integrity. If it's a healthy part. And then self-defense. A lot of people defend abortion on the basis of self-defense. Self-defense isn't just when there's a lethal threat. You can do self-defense just when someone's beating you up or raping you or something like that. So self-defense depends on violations of bodily integrity. If the fetus is a part, then self-defense is conceptual nonsense. 3 arguments: abortion against trespass, abortion against bodily integrity, abortion as self-defense. False on mere conceptual grounds. So I would love this to be true. Now, some pro-lifers are worried if it's a part, she can do what she wants. It doesn't follow. Conjoined twins could share a part, and that part may be necessary to one and not to the other. And the fact that you share a part and you can't do what you want with it because it'll kill another being. So the fetus has great value. It doesn't matter that's a part. You just can't kill it. But I love the possibility it's a part. Unfortunately, in the end, this turns out marine conduct, and my wife convinced me this is bad biology. I was hoping it was good biology and good metaphysics. That it was a part, because then so much abortion, there's still other arguments for abortion, But you can't do self-defense, you can't do trespass, you can't do biointegrity, and that's huge, huge win for pro-lifers, and a very easy win. You didn't have to do anything. You just had to make a conceptual argument, not even a moral argument. But so what can we say, though, otherwise? And there is a worry. Kingma puts forth this dilemma. I think the first horn's not sharp. If the fetus is a part, then there are going to be organisms, substances who are parts of another substance, and that violates maximality. Or, and she has perhaps more sympathy to the second horn, and pro-lifers will be more worried, the organism, the fetus, isn't a human being, and it's not until birth do we have a human being, because you can't have a human being part of another human being. So none of us were ever fetuses. Birth was our origins. Right. And so that obviously would make abortion very unproblematic. None of us could be aborted. I don't think the first horn's that bad, that there are parts, one kind of substance I think it can be a part of another substance of the same kind. Of course, it's question begging to use the fetus, but I mean, Catherine Sutton has an article. There are things like Pope's crowns, 3 crowns. There are jackets with it that are like liners of other jackets. There are desks that fold into desks. That doesn't bother me. The hylomorphic view wants to say these things are distinct when they're parts from not. I'm more inclined to think, I'm not sure hylomorphic theorists have to say that. I don't know why this atom can't just have some powers masked when it becomes a part of your body. It doesn't have to go out of existence when it becomes a part of your body, a virtual atom, and then come back in existence. I think the powers literature would allow us to speak of these things, powers being masked. But if that didn't work, I'll make it personal. Personal attack. You in like a sci-fi movie, you're eaten, swallowed by this Leviathan, and you become a part of that Leviathan. That is, you get hooked up topologically, and you contribute to that Leviathan's metabolism. Maybe your CO2 is crucial for it. You're like, some people think gut bacteria is a part, not a symbiote or parasite, but actually a part, because it contributes to life process. So let's just say you're playing a role in that Leviathan. Maybe your perspiration, your waste, your exhaling, crucial to its metabolism. And we could even say you're topologically connected. So just like the arm to the shoulder, you're connected, become connected to the thing's abdomen. Tell the story about immune reactions, homeostasis, whatever. I mean, in the end, I don't think you can tell this story on homeostatic, immunological, metabolic grounds. The fetus won't be a part of the mother, but let's pretend you can do it. I don't think you're going to say you went out of existence, and then when Schwarzenegger and Stallone in the movie cut open the Leviathan's stomach and free you, you haven't popped back into existence or a duplicate of you. So I just think all of us think we could become parts of an organism. Maybe it's far-fetched to imagine yourself a part, but I go, when I can't convince people otherwise, I make it personal. I go, you've been swallowed, sci-fi. However you define part, I'm going to make you in that relation. You are contributing to their life, just like a blood cell might contribute. And blood cells aren't connected. They float in 3. Or if you have to be connected, like the heart and stalk connecting to the rest of the body, do that. I don't think you've gone out of existence. And I don't think you pop into existence when you're cut out by the movie stars. So I'm not that worried about that. But anyway, I think the correct answer is the fetus isn't a part. Maureen Condick has sent me a paper unpublished, and my wife has one coming out in Journal of Medicine Philosophy. It just said, on topological grounds, the fetus isn't connected to the mother in a way that we have what's called a fiat boundary. A fiat boundary is like a postal code, or your arm and shoulder, and it's just not a boundary like between me and the desk or the fish in the aquarium. There is a boundary there. The placenta is not part of the mother. Kingma thinks the placenta is both part of the fetus and the mother is all intertwined. The placenta, every biologist I've read, she says it's part of the fetus, has her DNA, it's grown by her, made her. And of course, it's terribly intertwined with all these tissues of the mother, embedded in the uterine wall. But Condick says that's just like tree roots and is all going to have clumps of dirt all about. Or my wife's example is, when we have all these chargers in a box, they're all tangled up and it's hard to pull them apart. But you can clearly see they have distinct boundaries. And then King was just wrong. She says there's not a layer. There's this Nor's layer, and then later this Nittibuck layer, and she thinks that's no more a real dividing line than where the barber cuts your hair. But there really is. You look at pictures, there really is a very difference there. And then homeostatically, the fetus is doing all sorts of things. Not only before it becomes embedded, it's doing immunologically, trying to keep the mother at bay. It's doing its own homeostasis. Its own metabolism doesn't stop when it becomes embedded. It's doing all sorts of things. My wife is talking about how it's producing its urine will be producing antibodies. I'm sorry, not the urine. The amniotic fluid is produced by the fetus, and that will protect it against the mother's body. It's producing antibodies. It's making the mom's body tolerate it. There's a funny paper by Hilary Yancey said on how the morphic grounds the mother is a part of the fetus's body. The fetus completely takes it over. And Maureen Condick makes that claim too. She hadn't read Hilary, but she said, on grounds like the mother is contributing to the fetus survival. The fetus isn't contributing to the mother's survival, unlike other parts. Not all parts contribute to survival. Reproductive parts don't contribute.
I was actually right about to bring that up because I have a friend who published a paper on Springer recently. And it was actually right there responding to Kingma and using some of these examples to perhaps get a different intuition that mother is actually part of the fetus rather than the reverse. Because it seems maybe to us, like when we're looking at things, it doesn't seem obvious. But when you actually get to, okay, well, what's happening? What is the fetus getting from the mother? What is the mother getting from the fetus? It might appear so to be reversed. And I love that Godnick shows.
Right. The big thing is the topological condition. It's just not. It is a bona fide boundary. It's not like a fish in an aquarium, which Smith and Brogard originally pointed. They're connected, but it's more like soil and roots, or one charger and another. It's hard to disconnect them, and it may be a bloody mess if you do so, but their boundaries are there. It's a bona fide boundary, and there's just so much going on homeostatically, controlling its temperature, too much metabolic activity going on. Condick said, saying the mother maintains the homeostasis of the fetus is like saying the pond maintains the homeostatic condition for the frog. Sure, the pond's creating a temperature the frog can live in, but we don't say the pond is doing the homeostatic work for the frog or tadpole is not distinct from the pond, because the pond's creating temperature, the mother's creating temperature, but the fetus is still doing so much, controlling its own temperature, changing its heart rate, sending all sorts of messages to the mother. The homeostasis is trying to keep your environment in a safe parameters, and the first environment, my wife points out, of the fetus is the mother's body, and so the fetus is doing all sorts of things to keep itself safe. So it's not homeostatically dependent on it. And the mother doesn't immunologically tolerate it. The fetus is doing all these things to keep the mother. The tolerance is going in both directions. So anyway, if you read my wife's article, Come on JMP, or when Condick, hers, just see, it doesn't look like the biology is supporting King's view. But as I said, I don't care if the fetus is a part. And unlike the pro lovers, I wish it was. I'm kind of disappointed reading my wife's paper and Maureen's Condick's paper that said, oh, it's not, because I'm always thinking about abortion, and that made it so easy. I've had so many people tell me about a right of bodily integrity and a right to self-defense. You don't have that against your arm, leg, and heart. You don't have it against the fetus. Anyway.
I think it's pretty recent, although it seems more like a pop culture question, but rather it was somehow we got into the scientific community and philosophical community. But the one I have for the ending, and this is one that actually I get asked this sometimes. I don't know about other more academic oriented philosophers. Would it be the case that a lot of metaphysicians or bioethicists who are pro-life and want to, I guess, prevent abortion tend to take animalism or other types of views that specifically are not going to allow abortion because they want to they have this strong intuition about abortion and might be a bit more biased from their end. The intuition is wrongly placed there.
Yeah, you certainly can't let a moral position be to your choice of metaphysics. That seems somewhat morally bankrupt. Nonetheless, as I mentioned before, some broader moral views, like just the possibility of autonomy, becomes impossible if we're in a constitution or persons and animals aren't identical. So I think many people are willing to let this sort of broader moral issue come in as a reason to be opposed to certain metaphysics. But yeah, I don't think a pro-lifer should choose their metaphysics. At most, it would be one consideration amongst many, and so it shouldn't be doing the work for a pro-lifer that it gets in the result. I mean, you don't want that result if it's not you. You want to have a good argument that that's you there, or you don't even need this. I call this one of the two dogmas of pro-life metaphysics. Even if you were never there in the womb, early womb, you want there to be something there that's identical to a postnatal person who has interest and great value. So if it wasn't the case that there was something there, then you should not be opposed to abortion. I mean, your opposition to abortion is assuming a metaphysics. There's a being there greatly harmed and wronged. So you don't want to choose a metaphysics to just be silly to choose a metaphysics that would support a moral view, when that moral view, you only have it in the first place because you thought there's an animal there. Now, maybe since you already thought there's an animal there and you're pro-life, you'll fight even harder for the animalist view, right? But you're not going to defend the animalist view because you're pro-life. You're only a pro-lifer because you thought there was something there of great value, there was a subject of harm. So I suspect what's going on is no pro-lifers defending animalism from the outset because they're pro-lifers. It makes no sense. Like if I had all these good reasons for the soul and no soul was there in a mindless animal, I wouldn't be worried about what happened to that mindless animal. It's only if I do think there's a being there that's a subject of harm, and then maybe because I'm opposed to abortion, I'll even strengthen those arguments for that subject of harm. But no pro-lifer is going to choose a metaphysics on their pro-life view. I think they'll just defend it more vigorously, given that they think they were once in the womb. Or, as I said, that's not even necessary. That's one of the two dogmas of pro-life metaphysics. You just need there to be an animal there, even if you're not identical to it, that can, as great moral status, can be harmed by its death. And that's sufficient to make abortion wrong. So you may want to then defend that view. So you don't even have to defend animalism. You can be a pro-lifer while thinking you are constituted by animals or something else. You just have to think that there's an animal there that's wrong, that wronged, and you may not be identical to it. You may be essentially a thinking being. Say you're a four-dimensionalist. You think, okay, of all these thinking stages, I'll be the one that only has self-conscious thinking stages. There'll be other things there that have merely sentient thinking stages, and there'll be some things there that have no thinking stages. But if they have interest and they can be harmed by their death, then abortion will be wrong, even though you and I couldn't be aborted. So I don't think there's anything to this claim other than it may make us pro-lifers a little more interested in animalism. As I said, you can be a pro-lifer without being an animalist. You just need there to be an animal there that's greatly harmed. And so the metaphysical debate is not as important to abortion as people think. We don't have to be there in the womb for abortion to be wrong. There just has to be something there in the womb, an animal. And we don't have to be identical to that animal. There just has to be an animal there, though, because it's going to be co-located with us, or it's going to use our brain to think, can have a valuable future, like Marquis would say. That would make abortion wrong. So people just wrong that abortion hinges on the metaphysics. That's just what I call one of the dogmas. A necessary condition of abortion wrong. You and I were once fetuses. Not true. So if someone says you want to argue for abortion because you believe, it's wrong and you could have been aborted, I'm like, don't need that. Don't need myself to have been a being that could be aborted to be opposed to abortion. And no pro-lifer is going to be opposed to abortion if they don't have a metaphysics. I mean, that would be such an irrational view, just to think we come into existence when we become self-conscious and therefore I'm opposed to abortion. That would be more like an argument against contraception. Well, I don't want something to prevent me from coming into existence, but that's not driving anyone.
I guess some people have tried to argue that, well, maybe we're like sperm, we were like one sperm, or sperm was at least a constituted part of us, and that could be the case.
Eugene Mills says, if you think you were once a zygote, you were also an unfertilized egg.
Yeah, I read that paper.
I love that.
right after I read Marquise's paper, I read that
Yeah,
because I think it was specifically supposed to address the
right.
Marquise's.
So yeah, he joked we're all older than we think because we go back, eggs go way back. We're also all bastards. We once existed without our mom being married, and her mom could have married someone else. You can yell at your mom. They could have been taller, richer, the more famous dad. You picked this schlunk. It's a very funny theory.
Um,
Uh,
I want to thank you very much for coming with me today,
Thank
and
you.
it was definitely an awesome discussion. I love your answers to these questions, because they're very different from most of the I guess people interested in metaphysics of identity. Um, I would love to have you sometime again in the future if there's any new work you publish that I get super interested in. I would love to.
I fear I've told you all my ideas and have no other ideas to talk about.
Uh,
Such an extensive
well,
it.
well, if you get us some new idea, I think that
We
will
had a
that
new
will be
idea.
appreciated.
Okay.
We were also been thinking of having who was it? It's one of the pro-choice professors. It's not Jeff McMahon. It's the one who argues for dispositional desires. Do you
Boonin, David Boonin.
David Boonen? Yeah,
He's great.
we were thinking of having David Boonen and some other pro-lifer. I think we originally tried to go with Beckwith. Unfortunately, Beckwith declined. He couldn't do it. If maybe you will be interested in having a discussion with specifically Boonen here. I don't know about that. I don't know if Boonen wants to.
I tried to get David came into the Romanel and keynoted. He was working on death. And I put on a Romanel with Kaiser, Ebro, and this pro-life lawyer, Steve Gillis, about his new book. And I asked him, I even offered him $1,000 to then come respond. And he said he's working on other things now. So I think he's moved on from abortion. If you find out what he is working on, you may be able to get him. But I offered him a lot of money to talk about abortion to a panel to respond. And he just said he just didn't want to. So, and you probably don't have $1,000 to hold in front of him, but he's great. I mean, I've had argument with my friend Steve Kirshner, who's the best bioethicist, and I said McMahon, and he said Boonen, and I got Boonen second, McMahon's first. He thought McMahon was second, Boonen first. So
I would agree with yourself. I do think that McMahon is substantially
Boonen,
better.
his
Substantially.
range is unbelievable. The things that Boonen writes on, I'd love to get him back to my Romanel Center. He just had Frank Beckwith up. He gave a great talk on abortion. Did we need these thought experiments? It was very funny. He would say things like, when someone's pregnant, they never go, this is like having a violinist connected to you. You know? So it was quite good. And it's already been published.
Um, I would also like to thank the audience for listening. It was quite a long interview, and I do hope it was enjoyable for everyone listening. I hope to see you all in the next videos, and have fun and continue reading philosophy. Bye bye.